Vatican II, the Intermediate Session. In preparation for the third session, meetings were held at Solesmes. Around Domprou were gathered Bishop Morio, Bishop Sigo, and the well-known theologians Dom Freno, Canon Berto, who had kindly accompanied me to Rome in the capacity of peritus, and myself. Several important documents emerged from these meetings. 1. A letter to the Holy Father on the danger of the ambiguous expressions often used in the wording of the Council's schemas. It remained unanswered. 2. An important work on the schemas De Revelatione and De Ecclesia, which should be in the hands of all who study the conciliar texts. 3. A note addressed to the Sovereign Pontiff concerning the first 3 chapters of the schema Constitutionis de Ecclesia. This very complete note on the Apostolic College and collegiality was drawn up by Cardinal Lareona and signed by certain cardinals and superiors of religious congregations. I most willingly added my signature to it. It received a reply in the Pope's own hand, utterly disappointing and disconcerting. Hence, the 3 documents which follow. 1. Letter on the ambiguities. 2. Cardinal Lareona's note. 3. The Pope's reply. Document number 1. June 1964. Letter addressed to the Holy Father, signed by 5 conciliar fathers, on the danger of the ambiguous expressions. Most Holy Father, humbly prostrate at the feet of your holiness, we most respectfully beg you to deign to receive the supplication that we venture to address to you. On the eve of the Council's third session, we are studying the schemas put forward for discussion by and for the vote of the Fathers. In the case of certain of these propositions, we have to avow our grave disquiet and our keen anxiety. In these statements, we find absolutely nothing of what was laid down by His Holiness John the 23rd, namely, quote, that accuracy of terms and concepts which was the particular glory of the Council of Trent and of the last Vatican Council. The confusion of style and of ideas produces an almost permanent impression of ambiguity. The outcome of ambiguity is to open the door to the danger of false interpretations and to permit developments that are certainly not in the minds of the conciliar fathers. Indeed, the formulations are new and at times completely unexpected. They are so, it seems to us, to the extent that they do not appear to us to preserve the same meaning and the same bearing as those which the Church has employed up to now. For us, who have desired to show ourselves obedient to the encyclical Humani Generis, our confusion is considerable. The danger of ambiguity is not illusory. Already the studies made by some of the Council's experts, addressed to some of the bishops whose advisers they are, reach conclusions which we were always taught to consider as imprudent and dangerous, if not fundamentally false. Certain schemas, and in particular the Decree on Ecumenism and the Declaration on Religious Liberty, are thus exploited with satisfaction and contentment in such terms and in such a sense that if they do not always contradict, they are at least formally opposed as much to the teaching of the ordinary magisterium as to the pronouncements of the extraordinary magisterium made by the Church during the past century and more. We can no longer recognize in them either the Catholic theology or the sound philosophy which should light the way for reason. What seems to us to make the question even graver is that the lack of precision in the schemas appears to us to open the way to ideas and theories against which the Apostolic See has unceasingly put us on our guard. Finally, we observe that the commentaries made on the schemas under consideration present the questions put forward as if they were all but resolved already. This cannot fail, as we know from experience, to put pressure on the way the Fathers vote. It is not our purpose to put others in the wrong, but very sincerely to labor for the salvation of souls, which charity can ensure only in the truth. We beg to add that a large number of priests and lay people, to whom an extremely prolific press offers these dangerous perspectives of aggiornamento, confess themselves as greatly troubled. It is our prayer, Most Holy Father, made in the most humble submission, that at the opening of the forthcoming labors of the Council, Your Holiness may deign to give a solemn reminder that the Church's doctrine must be expressed unequivocally, that it is by having regard to this necessity that she will bring the new light needed by our times, without sacrificing the values which she has already bestowed upon the world, and without the risk of allowing herself to become a pretext for a resurgence of errors unceasingly reprobated for more than a century. Begging of Your Holiness the greatest indulgence for the liberty which we have taken, we implore You graciously to accept the assurance of our most filial respect and of our absolute docility, and to have the goodness to give us Your Holiness's blessing. Document number 2, October 18th, 1964. Note addressed to the Holy Father on the Schema Constitutionis de Ecclesia. Number 1. In this note, reserved to the Holy Father alone, mention is made of the first 3 chapters of the Schema Constitutionis de Ecclesia, and in particular of chapter 3, De Constitutione Hierarchica Ecclesiae et in specie de Episcopatu. In regard to the first 2 chapters, De Ecclesiae Mysterio and De Populo Dei, apart from a few remarks and reservations, we must express our satisfaction at the high quality of the work and at its success. We thus sincerely congratulate the Theological Commission upon it, for, in its first 2 chapters, the Constitution provides a fine description of the Church and of her true countenance, a countenance profound and mysterious. Number 2. Speaking in all sincerity and loyalty, the judgment we must in conscience bring to bear on chapter 3, De Constitutione Hierarchica Ecclesiae et in specie de Episcopatu, is very different. While fully recognizing the good it contains, we cannot refrain from expressing serious reservations on this chapter as a whole. Since we loyally believe what we are going to say, we have the right in domino, and not only the right, which we could sacrifice, but the inalienable duty to make known our fears and our opinions on the subject in the proper quarter. Number 3. In fact, after careful study, we think it our duty to say in conscience and before God that chapter 3, Roman numeral 1, as far as doctrine is concerned, brings us a. Doctrines and opinions that are new, b. Doctrines and opinions which are not only uncertain, but not even probable or solidly based on probability, c. Doctrines and opinions that are often vague or insufficiently clear in their terms, in their true meaning, or in their aims. Roman numeral 2. With regard to the arguments put forward, chapter 3 is a. Very weak and full of fallacy, as much from the historical as from the doctrinal point of view. The proof of this is that those who drew up the final version merely followed the method of excluding from the Biblical Commission's reply to the questions of Your Holiness the words indicating the lack of incontestable scriptural proof of what is put forward. b. Curiously careless of fundamental principles, even of those emanating from earlier councils or from solemn definitions. c. So permeated by these faults that an undoubted and readily proved partiality can clearly be seen, stemming from the influence of certain forceful currents that are not doctrinal in their nature, the aims and methods of which are not above reproach. D. Inaccurate, illogical, incoherent, and encouraging, if it were approved, endless discussions and crises, painful aberrations, and deplorable attacks on the unity, discipline, and the government of the Church. These fears are not based on a priori judgments, nor are they exaggerated, for, unfortunately, as is universally known, since such ideas have been spread by propaganda, even appealing to, quote, the authority of the Council, the sense of discipline has gravely diminished, particularly as regards the statements and dispositions of the Vicar of Christ. Number 4. The principal points of the schema with which we find ourselves in disagreement, or which fill us with grave reservations, concern, Roman numeral 1, the manner of speaking of the primacy of its meaning and of its essential purpose, Roman numeral 2, the power and personal qualities of the apostles, and how far these are handed down to the bishops, Roman numeral 3, ecumenical collegiality in the case of the apostles and in that of the bishops, and territorial collegiality, Roman numeral 4, the meaning and consequences of a possible conciliar declaration on the sacramental nature of the episcopate and membership of the, quote, episcopal college by virtue of episcopal consecration, Roman numeral 5, the succession of the episcopal college to the apostolic college in the ministries of evangelization, sanctification, and even of the government of the universal Church, and this of divine right, Roman numeral 6, the power and hierarchy of order and those of jurisdiction. In the accompanying documents, we shall try to make clear, at least briefly, the matters to which we are drawing attention, and to put forward the pressing theological reasons involved which, not without cause, awaken our apprehensions. Number 5. In this document, we do no more than stress that, Roman numeral 1, in our opinion, the doctrine set forth and contained in the schema, as a whole, and in particular in the points enumerated above, is a new doctrine which, until 1958, or rather 1962, represented only the opinion of a few theologians. Even these opinions were less common and less probable. It was the contrary doctrine which even recently was common and encouraged by the Church's magisterium. Roman numeral 2. The common doctrine, accepted in the Church as sound and more probable until 1962, was at the root of constitutional discipline and also concerned the essential validity of acts, and this as much in the sphere of councils, whether ecumenical, plenary, or provincial, as in that of government, at all stages, pontifical, regional, provincial, missionary, etc. Roman numeral 3. The new doctrine has become neither more certain nor objectively more probable than before as a result of the disturbing campaign of pressure groups who lobbied the council in a deplorable way and threw certain bishoprics into confusion. Nor has it become more certain as a result of the actions of many experts who, unfaithful to their true ministry, made biased propaganda instead of objectively enlightening the bishops by acquainting them with the status questionis. And finally, it has not become more probable through wide coverage of the press which, with its characteristic methods made use of by the progressives, has created an atmosphere which makes calm discussion difficult, fettering and hampering true liberty by making those who do not show approval appear ridiculous and unpopular. In such an atmosphere, scientific argument can no longer exert its legitimate influence in any practical way, and is not even given a hearing. Roman numeral 4. Thus, the new doctrine is not ripe either for a conciliar discussion, which is truly conscientious and exhaustive, and still less for conciliar approval, which can only be granted when there is absolute certainty, when the Fathers are fully aware of the value of certain doctrines and their implications. Most of the Fathers did not even have the means of acquainting themselves with the true scope of what was being put forward. This because of their inability in practice to follow technical documents, because of the propaganda already alluded to, because of formularies which are inaccurate and not clear, and moreover, because of the fact that the accounts themselves are not fully objective and enlightening, not to mention that they deliberately conceal certain facts. Thus, a period of mature consideration is essential on account of the gravity both of the matter under discussion and of the nature of the ecumenical council. Number 6. By stressing this last aspect of the need for a period of mature consideration of the new doctrine contained in the schema before the council could make decisions in regard to it, we wish to emphasize that it would be new, unheard of, and exceedingly strange that a doctrine which, before the council, was considered less common, less probable, less weighty, and less well-founded, should suddenly become, particularly because of publicity and not on account of the gravity of the discussions, more probable, even certain, or truly mature to the extent of being included in a dogmatic constitution. This would be contrary to all standard ecclesiastical practice, as much in the sphere of infallible pontifical definitions as in that of non-infallible conciliar definitions. If this eagerness to arrive immediately at declarations on these critical questions is intrinsic in the history of the Second Vatican Council, which, right from the beginning, declared itself opposed to doctrinal definitions, describing itself merely as a pastoral council, it can easily be understood how the total change of attitude in regard to this point is nothing other than a confirmation of the procedures used, that is, of the pressures exerted by certain groups. The latter, feeling themselves in the minority in 1963, wished to exclude the possibility of condemnation, but, having acquired an apparent majority by means of non-theological propaganda, now seek to gain their ends at any price. They are the very groups that allowed themselves to criticize the Councils of Trent and Vatican I, accusing them of undue haste and intransigence, when, on the contrary, it is well known that these councils, especially thanks to the wise procedure of the congregations of theologians, refrained from concerning themselves with theological doctrines that were no more than probable. Number 7. Finally, if we consider the gravity of the questions dealt with and solved in this schema, we must weigh their consequences from the hierarchical point of view. Considered thus, it may well be said that the schema changes the face of the Church. Roman numeral 1. From being monarchical, the Church becomes Episcopalian and collegiate, and this by divine right and by virtue of the episcopal consecration. Roman numeral 2. The primacy is injured and emptied of its content, a. because, not being based on a sacrament, as the bishop's power is, people logically tend to consider all bishops as equal, by virtue of a common sacrament, and this leads them to believe and state that the Bishop of Rome is no more than a primus inter pares, first among equals. B. Because the primacy is almost solely considered in its extrinsic function, or rather, in an extrinsic way in virtue of the hierarchy alone, only serving to keep it united and undivided. C. Because in several passages of the schema the pontiff is not presented as the rock on which the whole Church of Christ, hierarchy and people, rests. He is not described as the vicar of Christ, who must strengthen and feed his brethren. He is not presented as he who alone has the power of the keys, but he unfortunately assumes the unattractive face of the policeman who curbs the divine right of the bishops, successors of the apostles. One can easily imagine that this will be the main theme that will be used to claim new rights for the bishops. Moreover, the comment of many of the bishops, who had been influenced by propaganda when the Holy Father read the motu proprio Pastorale Munus, is well known. Quote, "The Pope is restoring to us, by a kindly concession, part of what he had robbed us of." The slight emendation made here and there by the Theological Commission, which felt that it was not obliged to accept what the Sovereign Pontiff himself had suggested, do not change the basic meaning of the schema. Roman numeral 3. Discipline, and with it conciliar and pontifical doctrine, are injured by the confusion between the power of order and the power of jurisdiction. In short, the schema injures the system of ecumenical councils, of other councils, of pontifical as well as provincial and diocesan government, of the administration of the missions. It injures the rules concerning the functioning of the power of order, always valid even if it is illicit, and of the power of jurisdiction, which can be invalid even if one has the order conferring the essential power concerned. Finally, all of this injury is because the distinction between the powers has not been respected, and because account has not been taken of what flows surely and objectively from the power of jurisdiction. Roman numeral 4. The hierarchy of jurisdiction, as distinct from that of order, which the text declares again and again to be of divine right, is shaken and destroyed. In fact, if it be admitted that episcopal consecration, being a sacrament of order, brings with it not only the powers of order, as the ordination of priest and deacon bestows them in its own degree, but also expressly and by divine right all the powers of jurisdiction, of magisterium, and of government, not only in the bishop's particular church, but also in the universal church, it is clear that the objective distinction between the power of order and that of jurisdiction becomes artificial, at the mercy of a whim, and terribly insecure. And all this, let it be noted, while the sources, the solemn doctrinal declarations of the Council of Trent, or more recent ones, the fundamental discipline, all proclaim that these distinctions are of divine right. The distinction between power and hierarchy of order on the one hand, and that of jurisdiction on the other, is objectively shaken, even if one tries to set up bulwarks, really futile, however, to save the appearances of the primacy, at least of what is called the primacy, i.e., the conventional primacy to which certain adherents of modern doctrine refer when they repeat almost word for word the deplorable texts which have already been categorically condemned. Why do we say to save the appearances of the primacy? Because, even if we accept the sincere good faith and the best intentions of those who proposed or accepted these bulwarks or limitations, for many others who give a different meaning to the primacy, considering it purely as vinculum exterioris unitatis, the bond of outward unity, the logical consequence will be, if the divine right of the episcopate, as derived from the sacrament of holy orders, confers the actual and formal power of jurisdiction, the latter of necessity follows the norms of the episcopal order, from which it proceeds, and is thus always valid in its exercise. The primacy, on the other hand, which does not come from a sacrament, will be able at most to make the use of jurisdiction illicit. And this is neither the only nor the final consequence. We have only to think of the repercussions on the greatly desired union with our separated Eastern brethren. This would be logically thought out in accordance with their ideas, and thus without full acceptance of the consequences of the primacy. We are sure that many of those who have put forward the new theories do not admit these consequences. They nonetheless do follow logically and strictly from the premises, that is, from the principles contained in the schema. And once the principles have been laid down and approved, the practical consequences will certainly be drawn from them, despite all the precautions and limitations that have been set up. But since today there is still time to prevent consequences so disastrous for the Church, it is necessary to foresee what these could be and, going back to the principles from which they spring, to realize that they clearly contain serious gaps, the same as those to which we have drawn attention in the methodology of those who put forward such opinions. Number 8. Before suggesting a practical solution as a result of the preceding considerations, we venture to add an extremely important reflection of a theological and historical nature. If the doctrine proposed in the schema were true, the Church would have been living in direct opposition to divine law for centuries. Hence, it would follow that, during those centuries, its supreme, infallible organs would not have been such, since they would have been teaching and acting in opposition to divine law. The Orthodox, and in part the Protestants, would thus have been justified in their attacks against the primacy. In consequence of these considerations, we think it our duty to ask the Holy Father, Roman numeral 1, to separate from the Schema de Ecclesia and other schemas based on this part of the latter all that touches the points we have just enumerated, deferring indefinitely their final discussion and approval. Thus, just as 18 years during which the Council of Trent was prolonged, 1545 to 1563, contributed to its complete success, the very pauses, moreover, contributed to the maturing of ideas, a period of waiting would today profit the necessary maturing of the problems raised by the new doctrines. Such a measure would in no way be a suppression of the liberty of the Council or a stranglehold on its free development, but rather a pause which would enable the Council to find its bearings and recover its psychological liberty, which is today non-existent. If this wise and prudent course were not followed, we might be carried away towards disastrous and highly dangerous solutions. Roman numeral 2. That, this being done, a complete and technical revision of these matters be proceeded with, a revision which must be made entirely outside the Theological Commission and its environment. This commission has already given us its finished work. It is natural that the majority should defend it energetically, whilst the minority, which, despite its repeated efforts, is not satisfied with it, is in the position of not being able henceforth to do anything. The text should then be submitted to a congregation of theologians, which, composed of persons of the highest quality, objective and unrelated to the Theological Commission, would make constructive criticism of it. Roman numeral 3. That this congregation of theologians, chosen and appointed by the Holy Father, by his personal mandate, should reconsider the situation in two particulars. A. It should take from the schema all that is mature and certain, all that can now be accepted as a positive result of the discussions that have taken place up to the present, and then redraft Chapter 3 in such a way that the doctrine put forward is fully and in all points in harmony with that defined in previous councils and contained in the magisterium. Such a congregation of theologians would thus have a task identical with that of the celebrated congregations of minor theologians who so largely contributed to the success of earlier councils. B. It should judge calmly the matters under discussion in order to point out the doctrines that Catholic scholars could accept and those which should be left to research and subsequent discussion, without trying to impose them for non-doctrinal reasons. Roman numeral 4. This work could be carried out after the third session, without fixing the date for the fourth session, so that the Holy Father should be completely free to come to a decision in accordance with the course and result of the labors of the Congregation of Theologians. Roman numeral 5. To avoid any unforeseen circumstances which might make it more difficult for the Holy Father to use his absolute liberty in a decision of this importance, it seems to us opportune and even necessary that such a decision should be taken authoritatively and directly by the Holy Father himself, without asking the opinion of the Council, and thus without having recourse to voting. Such an act of authority, desired by many, would not only be a practical reaffirmation of the primacy, but would at the same time promote a more rapid restoration of the balance necessary for progress, and would help us all to become effectively aware of the complexity and gravity of the problems in question. Roman numeral 6. To facilitate the Holy Father's announcement of such a decision, it might be opportune to have drawn up a clear and documented account of the minority point of view. This would indeed give the Holy Father an excellent opportunity of pointing out clearly that the schema, as far as these parts of it are concerned, is not yet either mature or harmonious. At the same time, the Holy Father would of course be able to appeal to the fact that many fathers of the Council from all parts of the world have stated their fears and put forward arguments which demonstrate the imprudence of setting out to unbalance questions which are in dispute. Most Holy Father, we have put forward sincerely and frankly that to which in conscience we have deemed it our duty to bring to your notice, and which, in our opinion, is of vital importance to the Church, and we are sure that you will see in this approach a fresh sign of our absolute loyalty to your person as Vicar of Christ and to the Church. At a moment in history which we believe to be grave, we place all our confidence in you who have received from our Lord the charge to strengthen thy brethren, a charge which you have generously accepted when you said, "We will defend the Holy Church from errors of doctrine and morals, which, within and without her boundaries, threaten her integrity and obscure her beauty." Drawn up by Cardinal Lareona and signed by several cardinals and superiors general, including myself. Document number 3. The Holy Father's reply to His Eminence Cardinal Arcadio Maria Lareona, Prefect of the Sacred Congregation of Rites. The personal note concerning the Conciliar Schema de Ecclesia has caused us, as you may well imagine, surprise and concern, as much by the number and high office of the signatories, as by the gravity of the objections raised on the subject of the schema's doctrine, and of the fundamentally contradictory statements supported, in our personal opinion, by arguments which are not beyond dispute. Moreover, the note reached us the night immediately prior to the third session of the Second General Vatican Council, when it was no longer possible to submit the schema to fresh examination by reason of the very grave and harmful repercussions easy to foresee on the outcome of the Council, and hence upon the whole Church, and particularly upon the Roman Church, that the suggestions of the note itself would have had they been put into practice. It seems to us for the time being adequate and fitting to inform you, for your peace of mind and in our own justification, that we on our part have neglected nothing of what it seemed right and expedient to do, in order that the preparation of the schema should be carried out in conformity with sound doctrine and by means of free, calm, and objective discussions. We ourselves have sought to take account of the controversy relating to certain affirmations of the schema and of the cogency of the formulae adopted, consulting both Italian and non-Italian theologians of excellent reputation, and reserving to ourselves the right to insert possible amendments after the final text, where orthodoxy or the clarity of the statement seemed to demand it. We ourselves have directed that the Commission de Doctrina Fidei et Morum, the Commission on the Doctrine of the Faith and Morals, should re-examine the controversial proposals, arranging that the Pontifical Biblical Commission should pronounce in regard to the exegesis of certain passages of Scripture cited in the Schema in support of the theories under discussion, thus obliging the Commission de Doctrina Fidei et Morum to meet again to re-examine disputed points. Moreover, it was reassuring to us to know that the Schema, which had been carefully screened by the Commission in question and by the competent sub-commission, had received the explicit approval of His Eminence Cardinal Ottaviani, Secretary of the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, and the even more explicit support of the Assessor of the Holy Office, Monsignor Parente, also a distinguished theologian, not to mention the favorable and almost unanimous vote of the Commission de Doctrina Fidei et Morum. We can assure Your Eminence that the drawing up of the Schema is entirely free from the pressures and manipulations to which your statements referred to above attribute its origin. Neither does it seem to us that the presentation of the Schema in the Council can be charged with undue innovation, as if it had been introduced without due notice when the matter of which it treats is bound up with those of the First General Council of the Vatican, and when its presentation was preceded by a lengthy debate in the first and second sessions of the Council. The General Congregation of the Council on October 30th, 1963, had already authoritatively given directions on the line to be taken in this matter, in such way as to notify each and every one of the Fathers of the Council of the content and importance of the doctrines in question. If there should remain any doubts in this connection, they should easily be dispelled by recalling that detailed pamphlets, authoritative though without official authorization, had been sent to the Fathers of the Council in support of propositions contrary to those of the Schema, and had reached the Fathers a few weeks before the reopening of the Council. It would therefore be almost an insult to their wisdom to suppose that they had no precise knowledge and that they were unaware of the grave and critical doctrinal aspects of the Schema. It appears to us equally unjustified to state that the majority of the Fathers were subjected to, quote, all kinds of propaganda methods, and that the doctrines in question were, quote, imposed by certain pressure groups who appealed to certain elements of a psychological rather than a theological nature. Nor in fact do we believe that the fear that the doctrine of the primacy of the Apostolic See is under attack has any foundation. We think rather that we ought to congratulate ourselves on the explicit and repeated professions of deep gratitude and sincere devotion that were made to that primacy on this solemn occasion. We can perceive in these serious appraisals and suggestions a noble concern for the orthodoxy of doctrine and a zealous solicitude for our personal frailty as regards the duties of our apostolic office, and for this we are grateful. We shall always be very moved by the appeal made, at such a special time, to our supreme responsibility, already made watchful by fervent prayers to our Lord, and by the offering of our unworthy life, that our testimony may be faithful to the purity of Christ's teaching and the true well-being of Holy Church. We beg you to believe that we are striving to follow the drawing up of the final version of the Schema with the object of removing from it everything which would appear not to be in conformity with sound doctrine, and of making all legitimate emendations to it. We cannot, however, close our eyes to the fact that new problems in the Church's life may perhaps arise. That will be the responsibility of him whose duty it is to guide her, to keep watch at the head to take care that such problems find favorable solutions, consistent with the fundamental traditions and highest interests of the Church herself. But we have confidence in God's help and are convinced that these solutions will be all the simpler and more useful from the fact that the Roman Curia, ever conscious of its high functions, will have no difficulty in receiving the conclusions of the Council favorably, with readiness and wisdom. Allow us, in this connection, to beg your Eminence and all who have shared your approach to us to aid us always in our difficult task, and to be so good as to reflect on what disastrous consequences would result from an attitude, if it were not based on true and tested reasons, so contrary to the majority of the bishops, and so prejudicial to the success of the Ecumenical Council, as well as to the prestige of the Roman Curia. We ask your Eminence and all those associated with you to persevere in prayer that the Holy Spirit may assist the Council's great and extraordinary assembly, and may deign to guide with his light and his strength him who is the least of all and who has most need of heavenly help, placed as he is by divine ordinance at the head of the Church of Christ in this solemn hour. With our respect and goodwill, we also send you, on this occasion too, our apostolic blessing. Pope Paul VI.